Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Carb Lifestyle Podcast. Today, you are going to meet Sam Apple. Thanks for joining us on the podcast, Sam.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So, you have a very interesting book out that you've written called Ravenous. Otto Warburg, The Nazis and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection, which is right up my listeners' alley and fantastic. I can't wait to get into that. But you want to just start by sharing with everyone. Obviously, you're an author, but who you are, what you're doing, and what inspired you to write the book?
Sure. I'm an author, as you mentioned, and I teach science writing and creative writing at Johns Hopkins University in the master's program. And I've been a journalist and a writer for my entire career, but only in the last decade or so have I moved into science writing. I became very interested in metabolism and low carbohydrate nutrition, and was reading a lot about that in various contexts, and was very surprised to discover that cancer could be thought of as a metabolic disease and tended to cluster with obesity and cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So when I learned that, I became very curious and decided to write about it. But I became all the more curious when I discovered this particular German scientist who lived in the 20th century named Otto Warburg, and he made sort of the seminal discovery in 1923 about how cancer cells use glucose. So once I discovered Warburg and this incredible story he had of living through the Nazi era, then I really had the two things I look for in a science story, both science that fascinates me and a character that gives me a way to tell the story.
Wow. So it's fantastic. I can't wait to get into that and learn a bit more about that. So what I find is many people that I talk to in the low carb space, they sort of come here because they've had a personal health story behind their investigation. Was that the case with you, or was it just simply curiosity from what you were reading and because of where you were in your work?
Yeah, it was mostly just curiosity. It's funny, people ask me like, "Well, how did you get into this?" And originally it was really curiosity. I had come across some of the articles by Gary Taubes, and those always interested me. It turns out that at the beginning I actually did have a lot of the symptoms of metabolic syndrome. Elevated triglycerides first and foremost, but I didn't even know what that meant when I first became interested. And then, I started to read more. I was like, wait a minute, I actually have metabolic syndrome or some version of it. So I do think it was relative to me personally, but that's honestly not what sparked my interest initially.
Okay. So can you tell us about the book? I mean, I've heard a little bit about the Nazis and all this connection and all this that was uncovered. And I think it's fascinating. I don't think many people are aware of it. Can you take us on a journey of what you found around all of this?
Sure. So, the book has a lot of different topics, but in my mind, it's first and foremost really a story about how cancer became such a common disease, or why it became such a common disease. And in the first part of the book, I sort of have to establish that cancer really did become more common, because a lot of people find that hard to believe. They think, oh, maybe people just are living longer now, or maybe they didn't know how to diagnose it. So I try to explore a lot of evidence from the late 19th century that cancer is becoming more and more common everywhere where people are sort of living a Western lifestyle. And then you find all these populations that are outside of the West or in remote areas, and Western doctors visit these populations, sometimes work with them for years, and find that they're virtually cancer-free. And these are doctors who know how to diagnose cancer, who see thousands of patients. So clearly something's going on. And then throughout the 20th century, this progression continues. Cancer grows more and more common. And there are a lot of different things that have contributed to this, of course, smoking being a major one, and there are some toxins in the environment. But the question I really wanted to explore is, have we possibly missed one of the very big ones, maybe the biggest one of all, which is that it's not only diet related, as many people have hypothesized, but specifically related to hyperinsulinemia, which of course is driven by diet. So that was, kind of the big picture thinking that I wanted to explore. And at the center of this was one very fascinating experiment and one very fascinating scientist, Otto Warburg, who in 1923 discovers that cancer cells overeat glucose and tend to metabolize it in this very unusual way. They ferment it, basically break it down without oxygen rather than burning it in the mitochondria with oxygen. So it's pretty surprising and pretty strange that cancer cells basically behave like microorganisms, like yeast or any single-celled organism that's in the presence of glucose. They just eat it and eat it, eat it, and then create lactic acid or alcohol, which gives us, of course, beer and wine. So one question is why cancer cells are doing this. What advantage does it give the cancer cell? And I talk a little bit about that in my book. But the deeper question really is, what triggers the process? And in 1923, no one, insulin had just been discovered. No one was thinking about insulin's role in this process. So Warburg, tried to figure out what was happening. And he thought the crux of the problem was that cells weren't getting enough oxygen, and this caused the fermentation. And some researchers do still believe this. But at the end of my research, I came to the conclusion that, the real explanation was that hyperinsulinemia was driving cancer, microscopic cancer cells to overeat glucose. And that same problem would explain, all these other diseases of civilization that, we talk about: obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So I think insulin and hyperinsulinemia and all these metabolic disorders that we have may be the answer to, the question that I really started with: how did cancer become a much more common disease? Which, of course, doesn't mean that hyperinsulinemia or obesity are responsible for all cancers, but that it's a bigger part of the story, I think, than we've realized, even bigger than the most sort of common estimates we hear in the news based on my analysis.
Yeah. And that was one of the questions I was going to ask you. Did you sort of see that there are ones that clearly would be driven by this, but others that maybe not? Like, did you sort of come, to that? Because I've certainly heard,
Yeah, I mean, it's generally accepted that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's pretty, I think, commonly accepted that there are 13 sort of major cancers that have been linked to obesity. But then we still have this secondary sort of controversial question of, is it the obesity itself that's causing cancer, or is it possible that the insulin is simultaneously driving the obesity and the cancer? And it doesn't have to be either or. It could be, in a way, both. But I think that the obesity, to some extent, may be a distraction from the core issue of the hyperinsulinemia, that really the root of the problem would be the insulin driving both, the insulin causing glucose to go into our adipose tissue, our fat tissue, and causing our fat tissue to grow, and also causing cancer cells to grow. One of the most striking things I learned in the course of my research is that cancer cells, tend to be covered in insulin receptors. They're hyper receptive to insulin. We talk about insulin resistance and that leading to elevated insulin, but for the cancer cell, they're not resistant at all. They're taking it up. And the single most common mutations of all in cancer are in these molecules that respond to insulin. It's called the PI3K pathway. And these, once you have a mutation in that, the cancer cell is even more responsive to insulin. So I really think that not for every cancer, but a lot of the cancers that we talk about every day in the news: breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, it's a little less clear, but I think it's fairly clear. Pancreatic cancer, all these, horrible, deadly cancers seem to be linked to obesity, and I think linked to insulin as well.
Yeah, right. It's fascinating stuff. So talk a little bit about what happened to Otto's research. Why are we uncovering this now, and why is this not more widely known? What happened?
Sure. So, in 1933, Warburg is living in Germany, in Berlin, where he worked, and his father was Jewish, so he was at great risk from the Nazis. And he was also, I wouldn't say openly gay, but lived with a male partner and was, sort of known to be gay. So he was at, in a very dangerous position under the Nazis. And was ultimately protected because, the Nazis were deeply paranoid about cancer, Hitler in particular. So the Nazis kept him alive, under the understanding that he would continue his cancer research, and he did. But after the war, a lot of people suspected him. He didn't. Wouldn't use the word collaborate. I don't think he worked with the Nazis. It's true that he could have left early on, but he didn't. He didn't realize how bad it was going to get, I think. And but people were suspicious of him. And after the war, he was also, making sort of extreme statements that he couldn't always defend. He was an incredibly outspoken narcissist who would, sort of dismiss anybody who disagreed with him. He said any theory of cancer that differed from his was garbage, was the term he used. So that didn't help things. But I think the biggest issue was simply that the type of science that he was focused on, metabolism and how cells take up energy, began to seem outdated after they started identifying specific mutations that could be linked to cancer. And it was, the new molecular biology and all the old world biochemistry that Warburg studied was considered outdated. And, there were stories that researchers told me of, seeing the equipment that Warburg used to use being thrown in the trash, and the metabolism posters coming down from the walls in the labs, and everything was about molecular biology and tracing these signaling pathways through specific mutations. And people just forgot about Warburg. But what's astonishing is how quickly it happened. His name disappears from textbooks. In 2000, they have this seminal paper called The Hallmarks of Cancer, which identifies, I think the 6 most fundamental features of cancer. It doesn't even mention metabolism, doesn't mention Warburg. In 2006, a major textbook comes out, doesn't mention Warburg. He's not mentioned. And The Emperor of All Maladies, this otherwise, fantastic book, but just left Warburg out. So he's just gone. And, science swings back and forth. So this happens sometimes, but the extent to which it happened is strange, and all the more strange because even as this is happening, we get this new diagnostic test called the PET scan, which really just looks at where in your body glucose is being taken up more heavily. It's radioactive glucose that they can see where it's going. And that's where you have cancer. So it's such a fundamental thing. And yet it was just completely off the radar for decades. But, in the late 90s, a small number of researchers, sort of brought it back into the mainstream. There was always a person here, a person there who remained interested, but it was really virtually gone until the late 90s.
But it still would be considered by mainstream as, out there, is that right? Like overall?
Well, it's tricky. If you talk about the science of what's going on inside the cancer cell and understanding metabolic processes, that's returned to the mainstream. But what hasn't returned to the mainstream, although I think it's starting to, is the dietary discussion. Like they, people in the leading cancer institutes are all studying metabolism. It's a hot new thing that a lot of people are studying, but some will talk about diet, but some prefer to just keep the conversation inside the cancer cell. To talk about how the glucose or the amino acids are being used, but not to talk about whether something in the diet might be, affecting that. They have a distinction between cellular metabolism and whole body metabolism. I'm interested in the relationship between the two, but not all scientists are.
Yeah, and I guess because, what we know about diet is, pretty much what we're told to, what we're told to eat. The dietary guidelines are not exactly supportive of, certainly here, of maybe a diet that's going to help prevent something like that. So, I can see where there's probably a lot of conflicts of interests and pressures, and gets very interesting, I guess, when you sort of delve into that. I want to know from you though, how hard was it for you to find research? I mean, did you have to, because I know things get buried, and how hard was it for you to find what you needed for the book?
Yeah, it was a long process. I mean, partially because writing this type of book was new to me. I've written books before, but not sort of a medical scientific book. So I had to kind of learn how to make my way through archives, and I'm not fluent in German, so it made it all the more challenging researching some of this stuff. But you know, you know, there are others that came before me. You know, Gary Taubes has covered some of this stuff, and a lot of people in the 40s and 50s, you know, kind of disappeared for a while, but there was stuff out there. And, you know, over time I learned how to do it. And Google Books actually helps a lot too, because, you know, you can search inside every book now. You can't actually get the book itself on Google Books, but then I would go to the library and dig up all this stuff. So that was a big help. But, you know, it was difficult, but also part of the, you know, the fun of the process is, you know, searching and making these big discoveries. And, you know, at least they felt big to me. The most exciting one for me is that I found one of Warburg's colleagues, Dean Burke, was a famous chemist in his day. And his son is still alive and lives in Washington, D.C. And I called him up, and it turned out that he had this treasure trove of letters in his attic. And so I found all this stuff. You know, it's kind of like a researcher's dream. So that was, yeah, that was pretty fun. But, yeah, no, it was hard to find some of the material, and hard to make sense of some of it.
Yeah, I can imagine. So when you sort of went into to doing this, what were some of the big, you know, when you came out the other end, what were some of the biggest things that you saw that, you know, maybe didn't see? Was there any big surprises? Was, you know, did you kind of confirm what you suspected when you started, or was it, just what did you learn, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did, you know, I had written a magazine article in 2016, which had sort of a, you know, it was the starting point for the book. So I had kind of in my mind the very basic outline of the story. And, you know, I certainly, by the time I moved from the magazine article to the book, I had an interest in how insulin was driving cancer. And, you know, once you become interested in that, then, you know, the next question is what in your diet is driving the insulin resistance and the elevated insulin. So I was interested in, you know, the sugar connection to all this as well. But I did learn a lot of new things along the way. You know, one of the things that really surprised me actually was that, you know, the story that I thought I was writing about the connection between sugar, insulin, and cancer was, you know, sugar raised insulin, and insulin contributed to cancer. But as I was working on the book, new research came out which showed that there are some cancers, colorectal cancer in particular, that seems to be able to feed directly off the fructose that's in, you know, the sugar we eat. So the effect may be more direct in some cancers than I realized. You know, this one sentence that stayed with me is from Richard Johnson, this famous fructose researcher, and he said that fructose is cancer's favorite food. And it's interesting why that is. I mean, a lot of the fructose is metabolized in the liver, so it wouldn't necessarily get to cancers, but it gets to more, you know, according to Richard Johnson, it gets to more places than you would think. And it's interesting though why fructose would be such a good food for those cancers that can manage to get it and metabolize it, because it seems to actually drive this Warburg effect that I write about, this shift in how a cell uses glucose. It basically, you know, is the fructose driving the cell to overeat glucose. It's a little bit confusing, but you have to remember, for your listeners who may not remember, maybe they do, that sucrose, the common sugar that we eat, is 1/2 fructose and 1/2 glucose. So, you know, it seems to be like a uniquely bad food when eaten, you know, certainly when consumed in liquids, and, you know, when eaten in refined quantity, in large quantities. So I learned more about that. But another thing that surprised me is, you know, I mentioned that I found these letters in this attic in Washington, D.C. And I had always assumed that Warburg, because he died in 1970, would have never had a chance to even understand the insulin cancer connection. But turns out that, you know, I found in these letters that his colleague, Dean Burke, was one of the very first people to sort of make the link. And Dean Burke said to him, you know, if you think about it, you know, I read this in the letters, that what you discovered is that cancer cells overeat glucose, and insulin causes the cell to take up glucose. So I haven't contradicted anything that you've said. I've just given you a new way to explain it. But Warburg was so insistent that he had the whole story right. And his story was that it was a lack of oxygen causing the whole thing. So he didn't want to hear it. So it was a big surprise to know that the Warburg had an opportunity to hear the whole thing. I assumed he hadn't, but that was a really interesting finding. And then, I think, the other fascinating stuff that I learned is just, reading about, these cultures that I mentioned at the beginning. There's these incredible stories from the 19th century and early 20th century of, populations that are virtually cancer-free, and reading about their lifestyles and how they would gradually adopt a Western diet. And then over the years, you start to see all the same problems creep in. I spent a lot of time reading about those cultures and just, finding, so depressing to see these changes taking place, but also to find it hopeful to, imagine that there could be societies where cancer, I don't think it would ever be absent, but much less common than it is today, I think it is realistic.
Yeah, it is very, very sad what's happened there. A couple of things I'd love to ask you. Did you find a difference between, so sugar, which obviously has, as you said, the glucose and the fructose component, as opposed to, what people in the low carb community consume in terms of whole food carbohydrates, which, we know as, metabolized into glucose once we eat them. Did you see a difference between that, or is it really that combination of the fructose and glucose together, or,
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think that, from what I've looked at, and I always like to remind people that I'm a journalist, not a scientist. So I'm, just taking what researchers have told me and, from what I understand from the studies. But it does seem to me that if you are already metabolically healthy, which most of us are probably not, but if you're already metabolically healthy, it seems that the combination of glucose and fructose, or just fructose, causes the insulin resistance more effectively than just glucose alone. So it really is a difference when you add in the fructose that seems to drive this liver fat and this accumulation of fat around the organs, which in turn blocks insulin signaling more effectively than glucose alone. But I think what complicates this is if you already are insulin resistant, and in America, certainly that's most of us, and I don't know if I am now, but I certainly was at one point. If you want to reverse it, I don't think it's enough in many cases to just stop eating sugar. At that point, I think you have to start cutting back on a lot of the other carbs as well.
Yeah, it's almost like you've missed the boat in some way. Once you get to that point. Yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah. What about vegetable oils and seed oils? Is there anything that came up around that?
Yeah, I didn't, I certainly, in the low carb community, I hear a lot of talk about that, and I find it very interesting, but I haven't looked at it closely enough to really form a good opinion. But a lot of people I know and trust are very, think that's a big part of this story as well. But I'm kind of drawn, influenced to some extent by Gary Taubes to this Occam's razor approach of looking at the most fundamental thing and starting your story there. And to me, that's really the introduction of large quantities of fructose, and fructose in the form of sucrose, table sugar, into the diet.
Yeah, and I think too, if you look at taking that out of your diet, you're going to be inadvertently taking out a lot of the seed oils as well, because we know, processed food has really much that combination of both. So it's yeah. Wow, fascinating stuff. So can we talk a little bit about, I know we've touched on diet, obviously, but I think what I'd love people to see is, obviously prevention is better than trying to cure. When we get to the point where we're unhealthy or metabolically unwell, or we even get diagnosed with cancer, I mean, obviously we would try and prevent that happening in the first place. So what's your overriding, I don't know if you go down this in the book, but what would be like an optimal, way to eat, say for yourself, where, to try and prevent cancers growing in the body?
Yeah, I think that, in the book, I do talk about prevention. I don't talk about treatment. Some people are interested in treatment, but I decided to really focus on prevention. Because, I think we just have to wait until there's more research on some of the therapies. But in the context of prevention, it seems to me that the evidence is quite strong that hyperinsulinemia, elevated insulin levels, are responsible for many cancers. So, I like to say that, think of we're always afraid about carcinogens. Is there something in our water bottles we always talk about, or this or that? Like, we need to think about elevated insulin in that same way. It's a carcinogen. It just happens to be a natural one that's in our blood. And when you're faced with a major carcinogen, the logical, urgent thing to do is to avoid it. If there was like a nuclear reactor nearby, you would get away from it. So I don't think that we need to wait much longer for more evidence to to do something about the elevated insulin, because I think it's a pretty clear carcinogen. And I think the way to address it is, any diet that will lower insulin or reverse, metabolic syndrome is a good diet. It seems to me that, the keto diet does that more rapidly and effectively and successfully than others. But I think in theory, it is possible to do it with other diets. Certainly some people eat a lot of carbs, but then do intermittent fasting, or other people are, manage to do it in a vegetarian, or even in some cases in a vegan way. I think all these things are possible, but, to me, the most obvious and straightforward way is just, the conventional keto diet. And so, I try to follow that pretty strictly, but, I do think that it can almost guarantee that I won't get type 2 diabetes. I don't think it can guarantee that I won't get cancer, but I think it improves my odds, and certainly, is a good thing to do and makes me feel better in all sorts of ways. So I'm, very happy to do it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of feeds into itself as well. I mean, when you feel good and you've got more energy, you're functioning better metabolically, you're more likely to do things that are going to help, keep you, increase your odds. I like that, so to speak. You're likely to move, you do some exercise, and, be outside with community because you're feeling good about yourself. I think there's so many other factors that come into that, just coming from being metabolically well. I mean, looking back, and I certainly was metabolically unwell and on my way to type 2 diabetes before I found this lifestyle. I mean, I had no energy to do anything. It was just, enough to get out of bed and look after my kids, and just, I was really just surviving. I think that's the difference. When you're metabolically well and you've got energy, you thrive, and that itself is just snowballs into increasing your chances. But as you say, I mean, nothing's ever guaranteed in life. No one's got a crystal ball, and there's so many other factors about the world that we live in today that we can't mitigate. But certainly for the ones that we can and that are in our control, it's definitely worth doing that. Fantastic. I think it's fascinating. I'm so grateful to you for writing a book and for coming to chat to me today. But I'm curious to know two things. What's next for Sam? And also, I know you've mentioned Gary Taubes, but who else are you interested in learning from at the moment?
Oh, sure. Well, I'll answer the second question first, because that's easier. I'm a big fan of Nina Teicholz and Jason Fung and Ben Bickman, and a lot of the popular names in the low carb world. And they've really been in addition to leading the way with their research and books, they've been very supportive of me. I don't have a huge following on social media, so I've just been really impressed by the generosity of a lot of these people. And so that's been great. And there's a lot of people that aren't well known, but I just learned from on Twitter and on Instagram now. I'm new to Instagram, but as far as my next project, I'm still trying to figure out. I've been thinking about maybe writing about another interesting personality, Stephenson. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but
I think everyone listening will be familiar with him.
Yeah,
carnivores in the
group.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, I like a good personality and I like a good adventure story, of course. And he's had an incredible life, and I know people have written about his life before, but I don't know that anybody has done him justice in the context of the new research on diet. So he could be interesting, but we'll see. I'm still in recovery stage from
I can imagine. I just couldn't even, imagine what it would be like to do what you've done. So thank you so much. Down below in the show notes, I'm going to have links to all your social media, but also obviously where people can buy the book. It sounds like a fascinating read. I can't wait to read it myself. Thank you so much for taking the time from Philadelphia.
Yeah,
talking
thank you.
to us today.
Yeah,
Little old Melbourne down here. Hopefully, you're not in lockdown like we are.
No, though we probably will be soon, the way things are
Oh,
going.
really?
But yeah,
Crazy.
yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. And I discovered recently that I can look online and see if people are buying the book in Australia on Amazon. I was happy to see that people are actually reading it in Australia, so I was excited about that. Yeah, so I'm glad to connect.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Sam, and look forward to chatting with you again.
Okay, yeah, I hope so. Thanks so much.